Thank you, Pat, for coming to talk to us about your new book.
Well, thank you, Jonas, for giving me this opportunity to talk about it.
What led you to write the book?
Well, it has a sort of a funny, long history. One part of it is that Bernard Lonergan himself wrote very little about ethics, and yet I myself, and I think those of us who spent time studying Lonergan's thought, gradually realized what a significant impact it was having on us in our ethical thinking and in our ethical behavior. And so I was inspired to try to understand better what you might call the implicit ethical thought of Lonergan, since he didn't spend that much time in his own writings focusing on ethical issues or even ethics in general. So that was one motivation. The second motivation goes back a number of years to the period when physician-assisted suicide was a fairly hotly debated topic. It goes back to the period when 6 very prominent American philosophers wrote a friend of the court brief at a time when a case was coming before the U.S. Supreme Court on physician-assisted suicide. In the end, the court did not make its decision on that case, but there was a long brief that these 6 prominent philosophers put together in support of physician-assisted suicide. And part of their argument was that the most important right a human being has is to write the story of their life. And there's no more important part to the story of a person's life than the way it ends. And therefore, people should have the right to get physician assistance in ending their lives. Now, Lonergan himself, several places, very prominent places in important essays and books that he wrote, speaks of the moment when we reach maturity. And for him, the moment when we reach maturity is the moment when we realize that it's up to us to write, as he put it, the first and only edition of our lives. Now, that sounds very much like the language that was being used by the what was called the Dream Team, the philosophers who wrote this friend of the court brief. And yet Lonergan, I know, would have come to a very, very different conclusion about physician-assisted suicide. And so this puzzled me. And the more I listened to the arguments that were being made by the 6 philosophers and other prominent ethicists in the United States, I came to realize that autonomy had become the great ethical principle. And yet autonomy was being interpreted in a certain way that struck me very much at odds with the way that Lonergan thought about autonomy. And so I thought it was important to bring Lonergan's thought into that conversation. So I started a book now probably about 12 years ago that was meant to address that. And I thought, well, since Lonergan himself hadn't actually written a book or even a major portion of any book on ethics, I should write an introduction or maybe an appendix on Lonergan's ethics. And when I got to a 160-page appendix to the book, I thought it was time to write another book, and that's what the Ethics of Discernment became. So that's kind of the background. That's how I got into it, was to just to clarify an approach to ethics that comes out of Lonergan's thought, and what I had learned about my studies of Lonergan and my conversations with friends and fellow scholars of Lonergan's thought, to make that available for use in these kinds of debates.
How does the book contribute to contemporary conversations about ethics?
I haven't really gotten that far. I'm wondering if maybe that should be the next book I should write. So I have some thoughts about how it would contribute, but the main thing of the book itself was just to get clear about what is, I think, a fairly unique and distinctive way of approaching ethical issues. So my familiarity with philosophical ethics, I would say that there are 4 approaches to ethics. They're somewhat intertwined, some of them at least, with one another. And the first approach is called deontology. And it is an approach to ethics that has to do with following rules, being just in the sense of fair and equal, and treating everybody procedurally the same way. The second is called consequentialism. Previous consequentialism grew out of utilitarianism, and where deontology focuses on proper decision-making, equal decision-making, equity in decision-making, fairness in that sense. In other words, it focuses on how one makes a decision, so that what's ethical is in how the decision is made. Consequentialism focuses on what comes about, what is produced by the decision, and evaluating whether or not something is ethical or not, depending on what kind of consequences comes. In its earliest stages, coming out of Jeremy Bentham, the consequences were basically pleasure and pain. So this is where the criterion of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain becomes a prevailing ethical concern. Bentham, among other things, was very concerned with the atrocious situation of prisoners, and was quite concerned to bring about reform in the justice system and the penal system, and came up with this approach, this utilitarian approach, as part of a concern to rectify that injustice as he saw it. It developed into consequentialism, which focuses not so much on utilitarian outcomes as on the consequences, but still this basic idea of the consequences, the goods that are brought about. Goods very much focus on whether or not something brings about pleasure, brings about contentment, brings about well-being, either loosely defined or more strictly defined, in which pleasure, comfort, material well-being are the fundamental goods. Third approach to ethics is virtue ethics, which has a revival that goes back maybe about 20, 25 years, which became a third contender. Virtue ethics goes back to Plato and Aristotle, Aquinas' approach to ethics. Other thinkers like David Hume have their ways of thinking about virtues. So virtues are things like generosity, courage, trustworthiness, honesty, friendliness, self-restraint. And so the idea of ethics is that you develop these kinds of ethical characters. The fourth approach to ethics is fairly recent, maybe over the last 15, maybe 20 years, is the neuroscience approach, looking at the ways in which human beings are influenced by their neurophysiology and ultimately their genetics to make certain kinds of decisions. And there have been a number of both neuroscience and social science experiments or studies. Things like whether, so a very famous one is one where a participant in the experiment has a bunch of papers and is walking along, and as an anonymous person comes by, they drop the papers, and they're in a kind of a flurry trying to pick up the papers. And the question is, who will stop and help them? And the study was set up in such a way that if they placed a dime in a payphone in the return slot, and if the people found the dime in the pay slot, they were 90% more likely to help person pick up the papers than if they had gone to the payphone and not found a dime. And so that way of approaching ethics is to look at the neurophysiological structures and the stimuli that will cause people to do altruistic things. This is also associated with neo-Darwinist approaches to explaining ethics in terms of evolved altruistic behaviors and so on. So those are kind of the four major things. But they're all contenders because one is focusing on how decisions are made, another is focusing on the outcomes, another is focusing on the character of the person as explanatory, and the fourth one is focusing on neurophysiological structures. What I think Lonergan has to offer is he's got a framework for thinking about ethics that respects what's true and ethical in each of those areas without giving exclusive predominance to one or the other. So the ethics that comes out of my study of his thought has elements that reflect on the right way of making a decision, has elements about what kinds of goods are brought about and ought to be brought about by making the decisions, has elements about the formation of character and formation of virtue, and also is concerned with the relationship between our neurophysiology and our ethical behavior. So I think, although I haven't actually done that kind of writing, I think this work that I've done on this book sets the stage for bringing these into a kind of integrated conversation with one another, as opposed to the situation that now, as it now exists. These are really four different camps that in many ways are arguing against one another and reaching conclusions on the basis of incompatible starting points.
Given the book's title, it's clear that the process of discernment is central to your approach. It's also a key term in Ignatian spirituality. Could you say something about the role Ignatian spirituality plays in the book?
It didn't occur to me until the book was well underway that was an appropriate term to use for the title of the book. So Bernard Lonergan was a Jesuit. He was deeply informed by Ignatian spirituality. He was born in 1904 and died in 1984. And around, roughly speaking, 1970, 1975, there was a very, very significant retrieval by historians and theologians in particular, including Boston College's own Harvey Egan, Father Harvey Egan. These scholars did a lot of work retrieving the original spirit of Ignatius's spiritual exercises. So there's a passage in James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man where he's on a retreat. It's a Jesuit retreat, and he's mocking what's going on in the retreat. And the mockery, I think, was well-deserved because the real animating spirit of the spiritual exercises as Ignatius originally conceived of them had been lost in the history of the Jesuit order for a variety of reasons. But around late 1960s, 1970s, Jesuits and other scholars were beginning to rediscover the original animating spirit. People like our own Father Harvey Egan from the theology department here at Boston College played an instrumental role in that recovery. Lonergan was originally practicing the spiritual exercises in this older mode. And he gradually discovered himself the true animating spirit of the Ignatian exercises, in part because of his conversations with Father Egan. And he recognized that his way of approaching philosophy was subtly related to Ignatian discernment. So Ignatian discernment is a complicated thing. Ignatius discovered that God worked in his consciousness in very subtle ways. ways that needed to be thought about carefully, thought about critically, because as Ignatius recognized, there's a lot that goes on in our consciousness, there's a lot that goes on in our feelings that's very disorienting. And yet, with some care and some training and some persistence, one can discover the movements within one's consciousness, the movements in one's feelings that are drawing one toward genuine good, and the movements that are drawing one toward unfair, unjust, ungenerous, evil actions and thoughts. And Lonergan's approach to philosophy even before he made this connection, even before he discovered that what the true intention of the spiritual exercises was about, is a process he called self-appropriation. And he focused mainly on self-appropriating how we do our thinking when we're doing our thinking well. And he discovered that this is really the sort of thing that Ignatius was also about in the spiritual exercises, discerning how God's Spirit is moving us not only to do what's right, but to do, Jesuits use the word the magis, or the magis, the more. So it's not just a matter of doing what's right, but doing what's more, going the extra mile, so to speak, and that God was calling Ignatius himself, and he thought every human being, calling them not just to do the minimum of what's right, but to go the extra mile and bring about greater good. And so I gradually realized that Lonergan's recognition of this connection really was the foundation for thinking about an ethics in Lonergan's own spirit. He had taught me, and he had taught others who had taken his own works seriously, how to pay attention to how we do our own thinking and how we do our own thinking well. And I recognized that was the cornerstone for thinking about how to reflect on when we're doing our ethical thinking and our ethical acting, and when we're doing it well. And for that matter, when we're going beyond what might be the mere legal requirements.
What do you hope is the readership of the book?
That's a good question. It's a fat book, so I think the readership will be anybody that is willing to read a fat book. I didn't intend for it to be quite as long as it is, but I was hoping that it would be there as a resource for people, maybe not to read from cover to cover, but to say, this is something I want to look at, and this is something I want to look at. So I wrote it for people who would not necessarily know about Lonergan's thought. There was a temptation I could have written it for people already familiar with Lonergan's thought, but that would have been a smaller audience. So I wrote it in such a way to provide, first of all, an introduction to the notion of discernment. And I focus on discernment as Aristotle talked about it, as St. Paul talked about it, as Ignatius talked about it, and then how I think it connects with Lonergan's thought. And then the next couple of chapters are summaries or overviews of the major points of Lonergan's own thinking prior to trying to extend it into the area of ethics. So it's meant to be for people who are interested in this distinctive approach to ethics, but don't necessarily have any familiarity with Lonergan's thought.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about the book?
Well, a couple of things. One is that as I wrote the book, I realized how important it would be to illustrate philosophical points, which can, for a lot of people, of course, be quite abstract and difficult to follow, to illustrate them with examples. And so I've drawn on literature in probably 5 or 6 times in the course of the book to illustrate points that I make from the philosophical point of view. In a couple of places I draw on my own experience. I share some anecdotes from my own experience about things. And so I've endeavored to make this not just a book for professional philosophers, but a book for people who can go back and forth between the points being made and the illustrations from literature. The other thing is the book is organized around three basic questions. They're modeled on three questions that Lonergan himself framed in a different context. And the three basic questions are, what am I doing when I'm being ethical? Why is doing that being ethical? And what is brought about by doing that? So the first one is actually the hardest question. What am I doing when I'm being ethical presupposes I am being ethical. And most of us are ethical sometimes and not entirely ethical other times. And most of us think we're being ethical when maybe our friends and family and neighbors don't necessarily think that's the most ethical thing we're doing. So we start out with a kind of a confusion. And it's a method of reflecting on what we're doing as we go about our daily, sometimes mundane decision-making, sometimes profound decision-making, to help focus on just what we're doing. So the first thing is just what we're doing. And the two keys to this kind of reflecting are helping us pay attention, helping the reader pay attention to the questions that are really live questions. When we're trying to make up our minds about the right thing to do, what are the questions that are there? How are they being answered? How are they not being answered? What kinds of advice are we getting from other people that really doesn't answer the questions that we need to answer before we can move forward and feel like we've made a good ethical decision and a good ethical action? The other thing is feelings. So there's a great deal in the book that focuses on the role of feelings in ethics. And this may perhaps be controversial. Traditionally, feelings are understood to be antithetical to ethics. Certainly, this can be traced all the way back to Plato, although I think Plato's understanding of the relationship between reason and feelings is more complicated than it's usually portrayed. But Plato, Aristotle, Immanuel Kant in particular are understood to think of ethics as a matter of reasoning and feelings as the things that get in the way of reasoning. Now, there's, of course, a lot of truth to that. People get into fits of passion and violence, and that clearly does interfere with their reasoning about what the right thing to do is. But what I learned from Lonergan and the sources that he was influenced by is that the idea that feelings interfere with reason comes from focusing on a narrow range of feelings. That in fact our feeling life is a very rich and broad range, that the feelings of wanting to do the right thing are themselves animating in important and indispensable ways to reasoning properly. So the relationship between feelings and reasoning is much more complicated, and I've tried to spell that out as best I could in the book, and did so in the hopes that as people begin to discover the greater range and the greater complexity of their feeling lives, that this will also help them in discerning the right way to go about making good decisions and bringing about good actions. So that first question, what are we doing when we're being ethical, doesn't actually have a simple answer. It's very much a self-exploratory process, and that's one of the reasons why I ended up calling the book The Ethics of Discernment. We have to really start to pay attention to what's going on in the complex ways we make decisions, in our feelings, in our questions, in our thinking, in our doing, and notice what's going on and notice when we're being faithful to our own animating spirit toward doing what's right and good, and notice when we're betraying that. So that's in a very simple way what I mean by ethics of discernment, which actually is a very complicated phenomenon.
Thank you, Pat, for coming to talk about your book.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation, and thanks for giving me this opportunity.